Jeremy Corbyn, the biggest constitutional, the biggest economic issue of our generation. And it seems you prevented the conference from debating a motion that would have set Labour's policy.
Sorry, John, nonsense. We had a statement, we had a debate, we had votes, we've had a discussion.
The very people who handed the thing out said this is mush, and it is mush, it doesn't say anything.
What it says is that we want to negotiate for a tariff-free trade access to the European Union, we want to protect rights and conditions coming from Europe in workers, consumers and environment, and that's the strategy we're doing. But crucially, we would also legislate immediately to give permanent residence to EU nationals living in this country.
But does that sit with the single market, the customs union and freedom of movement?
We argued for a transition period, and that the government has belatedly come round to sort of agreeing to, because we think that the whole thing has been very badly handled by the government. After all, we're 15 months since the referendum and they've made no progress at all. Therefore, the only sensible thing to do now is have a transition period, which I hope will be agreed between both parties to the negotiations. Remember, we're not a party to the negotiations.
No, but a transitional period is one thing. A commitment beyond the traditional, the transitional period to freedom of movement, to a single market, and to all the other things which people really do want out of this Brexit deal, there's none of it.
Our commitment is to access to the single market, access to the European market, to ensure that we protect manufacturing industry and jobs in this country. That is the basis. There was a referendum, there was a result of that referendum. We have to respect that result.
So you are passionately in favour of freedom of movement?
We are going to have to understand that large numbers of European Union nationals have made an enormous contribution to our economy, as indeed British nationals have across Europe, and that will continue.
But that's a completely different issue. Guaranteeing the rights of the people who live here is one thing, but it's the rights of people to come here. That is freedom of movement.
There will be a continuation of a very large amount of movement because of the needs of the economy and of people. That will be subject to negotiation of managed migration.
But we can therefore distill this as your personal commitment to freedom of movement.
No, what you're trying to do is distill something that doesn't yet exist.
Well, the danger is
that... No, hang on, the negotiations haven't finished yet, and we are not a party to the negotiations.
There are people already looking at you and wondering if you're the most anti-immigrant Labour leader of all time. Your commitment to freedom of movement has never been openly stated.
My commitment is that we will continue to have movement between Europe and Britain. Obviously, it's necessary for economy.
But you won't use the phrase.
It's necessary. It's necessary for families to be able to move. It's necessary for industries to be able to recruit them. The only point I've made consistently through the referendum and since then is that we would oppose and challenge the way in which companies exploit low-paid groups of workers, bring them in to undercut in the construction industry and many other industries, and so we would want a similarity of economic and employment conditions.
Now, in the last election, many people voted Labour precisely because they believed that in voting Labour there was a better chance of getting a better Brexit, if not possibly rolling the thing back altogether. Do you accept that you've disappointed them?
Not at all. We have campaigned consistently for an exit from the European Union that maintains the economic relationship with Europe, that protects jobs on both sides of the Channel and maintains that good relationship with Europe. And we don't turn ourselves into some kind of tax haven. We don't do sweetheart deals.
So a sort of Norway solution?
The relationship would be, I mean, it's hard to put parallels on it, the relationship would be a positive economic relationship, a positive movement relationship, a positive investment relationship.
But no power to affect it?
Well, of course we'd have powers to
Well, we wouldn't be members of the European Union, and what you're arguing for is effectively...
What you seem to be forgetting is there was a referendum that voted to leave the European Union.
By a very small majority.
There was a majority vote to leave the European Union. Personally, I voted to remain. Personally, I campaigned to remain.
The PFI policy that was sketched out by John MacDonald yesterday really looked at... He actually stated very, very firmly that not only did you want to freeze any new ones, but you also wanted to ensure to actually take back into public ownership those that had already been committed. Now, when your health spokesman, John Ashworth, talked on the radio this morning about the policy, he said, we will look at the hospitals and the rest that have been built under PFI. Which is it?
We want to take the PFIs over and take them back into public ownership, because it is, after all, wait a minute, after all, it is a public debt. A PFI debt is a public debt, and the interest rates paid on capital expenditure and the lack of control over the development of hospitals and schools that have been built under PFI is a serious administrative problem, and taking them over and exchanging the PFI for government bonds would actually save us all a great deal of money.
But it'll be
a very sensible thing to do.
But it will be 50 billion just on the health service alone. Where are you going to get the money from?
Well, you exchange what is already a public debt. There's a public debt of 50 billion, as you say, on the NHS alone through PFI. That's a public debt you and I owe.
So you borrow the 50 billion, or you get someone to give it to you?
You exchange it for government bonds in return for taking the PFI over. The interest rate on government bonds is obviously a lot less than the penurious rate of interest that PFI companies get.
So it's not a question of just looking at what's going on at the moment and taking a few back into public ownership. You're going to take the lot.
Some are different within the NHS, because some of the PFIs have actually been bought out in one or two cases by local authorities, and they administer them. Now, clearly, if the local authorities are happy and content with that and administering them, and it is much cheaper for the public, then that's obviously something we'd look at, and that has happened in one or two places.
Now, Emily Thornberry made a very personal attack on Boris Johnson. There's also been complaints from several Labour MPs of anti-Semitic statements in fringe meetings. And good heavens, the BBC's political editor, Laura Coonsborough, has to be accompanied by a bodyguard around a Labour Party conference. What has this come to? Is this the nasty party?
That is awful thing for you to say. This is not a nasty party. This is the biggest Labour conference we've had for many, many years. And nobody should be abused, whoever they are. And we've just passed a motion on racism and anti-Semitism, which is comprehensive, is inclusive, as it was supported by all wings of the party, and indeed unanimously agreed by our National Executive.
Well, the MPs, John Cryer and Wes Streeting, have both identified serious breaches of that already. I mean, what are you doing about it beyond passing rules?
Anyone using anti-Semitic language, anyone using any form of racist language, is completely at odds with the rules of this party. And
but aren't you also incredibly uncomfortable at the idea, not only of that, but much more the idea that the political editor of the BBC, for goodness sake, is having to be accompanied round this conference by a bodyguard?
I don't wish anyone to have to be accompanied by a bodyguard anywhere in our society, and certainly not in our conference. I will be talking to Laura Coonsborough later on. I do not want anyone to be abused by anyone, and I will make sure they're not.
Final question. You've always been quite voluble on the matter of Venezuela. Now, the disintegration of Venezuela you've blamed on all parties, just as Donald Trump blamed the racial violence in Charlottesville on all parties. Do you now accept what Amnesty International and the United Nations itself is telling you? Most of this violence is authored and carried out by the government of President Maduro.
I've looked at those reports, and obviously I'm appalled at any violence that's carried out and the sources of it. There is, I hope, going to be an effective regional process that will help to bring about conciliation and a democratic solution in Venezuela. I think the economic problems of Venezuela are partly the source of some of this, because there hasn't been enough diversity of investment of the oil revenues.
But you are one of the few European leaders who has real influence in Venezuela. Why don't you tell President Maduro just to stop?
I have made it very clear that there should not be any abuses of human rights, or any violence, or any abuses of free
by the
speech,
government?
of any abuses of human rights by anybody.
This is a Trump answer.
No, wait a minute. No, it's not. You seem to have a very strange view of what Donald Trump does. This is a process that has to be resolved democratically within Venezuela, and the regional powers.
Yes, but there needs to be...
The regional powers have offered to intervene to assist, and clearly any actions that oppress free speech are wrong.
But I notice you don't use the word government, and you don't use the word Maduro, and they are to blame.
I've said any, that includes the government, of course it does.
And President Maduro.
Look, it includes the government, he's the president
Do
of
you
it.
condemn President Maduro?
Look, Venezuela has been through a process of which it has been subject to a lot of opposition. They've had an economic policy which I think has suffered because of the fall in oil revenues, and there have been, quite rightly reported, abuses of human rights. They have to be deplored. They have been deplored. I do deplore them. Okay?
Corbyn, thank you very much.
Thank you.